Hello, friends. This is a really exciting opportunity for me to welcome again a very distinguished guest, a very important opinion writer for the New York Times, a scholar who engages with Islam and modernity, Mustafa Akyol. We're going to be speaking in particular about his book on the Islamic Moses just published. So, hi, Mustafa. Thank you for being here.
Hi, and thank you, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to always have conversations with you, and at this time as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you back on Exploring the Quran in the Bible. Thank you. And I mean, the cool thing about this book, which is entitled The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. I mean, I'm just going to shamelessly promote the book because, I mean, it brilliantly addresses Moses in Islam and in the Quran, but then it goes far beyond that, addressing sort of, I mean, the whole story, all kind of like the hidden stories of engagement and cooperation and friendship between Jews and Muslims. If it's okay for the first question, later I'm going to circle back and mention some of your earlier books too, but let's get right into a really important question here about the Islamic Moses, which is, what's distinct about Moses for Muslims and, especially this relationship with Islam and Judaism in regard to Moses. You wrote an earlier book on the Islamic Jesus. And I mean, from what I see online and also real life experience, that's really contentious, right? Because Muslims have their take on Jesus, Christians have their take on Jesus. Everyone's always fighting about this. But I mean, my impression is that with Moses, that's not really the case. It's kind of like a whole different kind of vibe, maybe, when it comes to speaking about the Islamic Moses.
Indeed. And if you want, there's a story in the very beginning, the introduction chapter of my book, and let me begin with that. I mean, the idea goes back to an email I had from a friend, I think more than a decade ago. He was a Christian friend in the US, and he asked me what translation of the Quran he should read to understand Islam. And I suggested Halim's translation, which is always really good. And he went through it, and he emailed me back a few months later, and he said, well, this is all nice, but I was expecting to learn about Muhammad, and mostly I learned about Moses.
Yes.
What is that about?
Yes.
And that rang a bell. I said, oh, yeah, I mean, the Quran speaks about Moses more than anybody else. He's mentioned 137 times, I think, his name. The very name Muhammad, peace be upon him, as you would say, peace be upon Moses too, is mentioned just 4 times. Like Muhammad is not narrated, but Moses is repeatedly narrated. The second figure in the Quran, the second human figure in the Quran most mentioned is, after Moses, guess who? The Pharaoh. Because these two figures, their struggle dominate a lot of the Meccan chapters, and I think that's an important part.
Okay.
And I tell a little bit about that. Then I ask, why this is the case. And I referred to Patricia Crona, who was a great scholar of the Islamic tradition from Western. She was not Muslim herself, but she was an academic expert on Islam.
Right.
She, she says Moses is the paradigmatic prophet for Muhammad. He's the role model that Prophet Muhammad is following. And you see this in the Sirah, in the biography. I mean, when the Prophet actually receives the first revelation, he's scared. He doesn't know what this is. And his wife, Khadija, they go to this figure, Varaka, this mysterious Christian.
Khadija's cousin.
Yeah, Khadija's cousin there in the city. And he hears a story. He says, you're like Moses, right? So Moses is the figure. There he mentions Moses as a role model.
Yes.
And then, beginning with that, I kind of start to weave that story into a bigger thing.
Right.
Well, that is because Islam is deeply connected with Judaism, just like Christianity is. And that's why people speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition today all the time. Well, there's also a Judeo-Islamic tradition, which people forgot in the past century because of the geostrategic troubles in the Middle East. But actually, there's a deep connection. And in many ways, Islam is actually more similar to Judaism than Christianity, or Islam is the more loyal heir to some of the Jewish precepts, as I put, on very staunch monotheism with no tolerance for images and a very staunch Unitarian understanding of God, and the idea of a religious law, the divine law, right? The halakha and the sharia, which I keep discussing in the book. And also, the Moses story has another element which is very interesting. Moses' story is narrated in the Quran in Meccan chapters in most cases. The Pharaoh story. There's a reason Muslims were persecuted in Mecca.
In Mecca. So between 610 and 622 by the traditional dates.
By the Quraysh, by the polytheists who were oppressive, and Muslims identified with the Moses and the Israelites. And the Pharaoh story is told and retold to them, so they know that other believers were oppressed in the past, but there is light at the end of a tunnel. And actually, there's a hadith where you hear the Prophet saying, I think for Abu Jahl, he says he's the Pharaoh of this ummah. Like the Pharaoh is associated with the Meccan pagans.
Yeah.
And then
so one of the bad guys among the Meccan pagans is compared to Pharaoh, right? So that advances that parallel. Or
exactly. Then you have Exodus, which we call Hijrah, which migration to another place. And then the journey doesn't stop. Then you have some wars, some battles, some conquest. The conquest of Canaan, paralleled here with the conquest of Hijaz, if you can say. And of course, then Islam goes on to be an empire with many conquests. So in a sense, Moses is the lawgiver and also the political, legal.
Yeah.
So, and so there is a parallel there too, which brings an everlasting question to Muslims and Jews.
Right.
How do you make a sense of this theocratic experience?
So what do you do now? What do you do about that? Yeah.
And that's why I have a chapter where I discuss Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish Enlightenment thinker, on how he looked back at this theocratic experience in the beginning of Judaism.
So, Mustafa, it's okay before advance, because we definitely have to speak with the latter part of the book where you advance into questions of the history of Jewish Muslim cooperation up to the basically to the present day. But staying a moment with the figure of Moses and Muhammad, I mean, one could say that, Jesus, in a sense, it's always complicated, right? Because like, which Jesus? You've written a whole book entitled The Islamic Jesus, but let's just say kind of vaguely the Christian Jesus. So kind of the wandering prophet in Palestine, with his Beatitudes, and then the suffering servant, who suffers and is crucified. He's kind of the odd man out of the group of three, that is Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, right? Because, it's just like extraordinarily different, at least the Christian telling of Jesus's life. Whereas you can make the case that Moses and Muhammad are understood by, let's say, Jews in regard to Moses and Muslims in regard to Muhammad as great men. Like, and I mean that in kind of like a, not just, awesome or whatever, excellent, but actually in the sense of like, men with a grand project, like, a dynamism, a boldness, right? So, both start with some questions. As you said, according to the stories, Moses, sees a burning bush, kind of hesitates, all that. Muhammad also hesitates, according to the story at Mount Hira. But then, they eventually sort of rise up to the challenge, and they have not only spirituality to share, but, like a political mission that they follow and carry out. So, I don't know if you want to expand upon that, but, that category of great man seems to be really relevant here.
Yeah, you're quite right. And with all the respect to Christianity, I think this is also maybe a great start for Christianity in the sense that it doesn't start with a story of its founding figure, Jesus Christ in this case, establishing a state. Christ is not that. Christ is killed by the state or executed by the state. And in that sense, it's actually an earthly defeat. Of course, there is a profound theological victory out of that. As Christians would emphasize. Yeah. But like he's crucified, right, by the enemies. Yeah. That's not the case with Muhammad. That's not the case with Moses. That's why in passing, I said in the book, it's very interesting that the Quran shows great respect to Jesus, his nature, his birth, his miraculous birth, Mary, and all those things. The Quran is not interested in the political journey of Jesus, Pilate, and crucifixion and all that. Only in one place, as you well know, the Quran says, no, he was not crucified and they could not kill him. Only, I think, to assert that they could not defeat him, because it may be seen as a defeat, right? I mean, as an earthly defeat.
Mm-hmm.
So, and why the Quran actually has that conversation about the crucifixion is also something I discuss in the chapters. Very interestingly, that the Quranic assertion about crucifixion comes as a polemic against not Christians, but Medinan Jews, because those Medinan Jews at the time didn't have great relations with Christians for a lot of reasons, historical reasons, and their attitude towards Jesus and Mary were negative, as we understand. And the Quran engages in a polemics with them. So that is another aspect of the book that another aspect of the book in which I emphasize that we today sometimes think of Judeo-Christian tradition on one side and Islam on the other side. Muslims themselves think Islam and the Ahl al-Kitab on the other side. Well, when Islam came to the world scene, Jews and Christians were not in good terms in that part of the world. You see a Jewish kingdom in South Arabia, in Himyar, being destroyed by the Abyssinians, and Byzantine Empire had a lot of anti-Semitic laws. That's why Jews sided with the Sassanids. And so there is this interesting triangle, right? It's not that Jews and Christians are on one side and Islam comes. Islam comes and finds itself in the middle of actually sometimes dispute between these two groups, which explains to me to some extent what really happened in Medina, which is a chapter in the book.
Yeah, we should definitely get to that. Now, you double down in the book, as I see it, on sort of uncovering the hidden history of friendship between Jews and Christians. Between Jews and Muslims. Important correction: Jews and Muslims. And I mean, it's just in the current context. It's just very intense and a very difficult message. You know, if you're messaging this, that no, there really is this legacy of friendship between Jews and Muslims. Obviously, we're recording this in September 2024, so it's about a year. Since October 7th to 2023 and everything that's taken place since then. I mean, what was that like for you as, you write the epilogue? I think you wrote the epilogue in March just of this year, 2024. So you continue to work on the project, and then, you've been working with different folks, talking to different folks about the book. I mean, what was this experience like during the Gaza war to be working on this project?
Well, painful. I should say that I finished the main book, by September 2023.
Okay, just before. Yeah.
I was thinking that this would maybe even contribute to peaceful efforts and perspectives between Muslims and Jews, including Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs.
Right.
A few weeks later, October 7 happened, right? And I was shocked to hear the news of terrorism committed against Israeli civilians. Then after that, I got shocked, and still I am traumatized by the destruction of so many innocent civilian lives and the whole Gaza Strip almost. So this is a very painful time, and I think that's why the epilogue is titled "The Darkest Hour." I say maybe this is the darkest hour between Muslims and Jews in history. Of course, this is not a religious war. Not every Jew and every Muslim is involved in this. But because Israel is a Jewish state and Palestinians are mostly Muslim and a lot of Muslims feel for them, this is creating much tension between Jews and Muslims around the world, even we see in the streets of North America. But my book, I believe, still has a message there, which is what I'm telling in this book, in that political sense, is, look, this is not a war that is based on ancient hatreds that can never be resolved.
Which you hear a lot, right? You hear all the time.
You hear that all the time.
It's kind of an American thing to say.
Like, oh, these people are fighting each other for centuries. No, that's not the case at all. I mean, the epilogue has a quote from a scholar who wrote about the 19th century Ottoman Palestine, and he says, in the 19th century, nobody could imagine a conflict like that at that moment in Ottoman Palestine, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians could live. It was there was some supremacy of Muslims, the Zimmi laws, we know all that, but it was peaceful. I mean, compared to today, this is a national conflict, and it's a product of nationalism, which is a modern ideology. As a Turk, I've seen it terribly, in the Balkans first, then in Turkey itself, Turks and Armenians. It brought much destruction and hatred to people who used to be neighbors for centuries, right? I mean, nationalism is a very dangerous force, and this is another chapter of these nationalist conflicts in the Middle East, and we will be able to see an end to it when we can find a way to help these two peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, which claim the same land, to somehow share it, rather than just saying it's all mine. Unfortunately, there are forces on both sides which exactly want to do.
Now, my guess is you got criticism from both sides, but I'd like to ask you about what it's like as a Muslim in particular. Do you have people or other intellectuals sort of appealing to you with a line like, now is the time to show solidarity with Muslims, since our Muslim brothers are suffering in Palestine, and this kind of book is just it's too close to. I mean, it's not the time for this kind of like engendering friendship and things. Do you have to deal with that? Now is the time to stand up and be part of the anti-colonial or whatever struggle, and not to sort of reach across the aisle or whatever and shake hands with others.
I didn't get a response like that yet much. I got some of that when I objected to October 7 attacks online, and some people who liked those attacks thought that I was too...
Yeah, you have that incredible line where someone said, what did you think the anti-colonial struggle would look like? Someone wrote, yeah.
Well, I do believe in solidarity, but I also believe in building political wisdom. And I think... the question is how this is a terrible situation that the Palestinians are in from 1967. Some can trace back to 48. Israelis are not finding security either, like the constant risk on them. But then their anti-terrorist campaigns are incredibly destructive to the peoples around. So what do we do with this? I sometimes have given people a personal hero of mine, Alija Izetbegovic, the Bosnian leader in the 90s. He led a war against Serbian aggression in the 90s. The Bosnians had a right to defend themselves. It was this very genocidal campaign on them. But ultimately, at some point, he made peace. And with peace, he didn't get everything the Bosnians wanted, but he got still a country in which Bosnia could stand on with the Dayton Agreement. So I mean, this is a very political topic, which I address only very at the end of the book.
Yeah.
So my book is not, but my sense is that we have to stand up for the Palestinians, but also we should ask the question, how do we end this violence? And it might not be just about just hate the other side and be strong against the other side. Also understand where the other side is coming from. What are their anxieties? What is their history? What are the nuances within them, so you can maybe build still some alliances and bridges. So that's been my approach, not just on this book, but the whole Palestinian question for decades, I think.
Yes. I want to ask one more sort of contextual question, and then we'll circle back to the key elements of the book, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. And so the second contextual question I want to ask about, as a Turkish scholar, we don't have to comment on politics today in Turkey, but just, the story is, I imagine, I had the sense from reading it, actually anticipated this beforehand, because we've had conversations, about Ottoman history, a little bit about that. So I've heard sort of your take on this, but, even reading the book, you can sense that there's something personal here for you, because part of the story, what Jews sometimes refer to as the lachrymose history of Jews, the sad history of persecution and suffering. But the Ottoman Empire played like a healing role for Jews, many Jews, not only after 1492, but yes, after 1492, and in other periods as well from other areas of Europe and Russia. Many Jews found refuge and safe haven in the Ottoman Empire, even were able to be in Jerusalem, Ottoman Jerusalem. So, could you just speak about that a little bit? Like, as a Turkish scholar working on this project, like, how is it distinct for you?
Great question. Indeed, I try to look at this topic as an Ottoman, not even just ethnically Turkish, but as an Ottoman.
Yes.
Which was an empire of many peoples. So we had Jewish peoples, we had Arab peoples, we had Bosnians and Serbs and Greeks and Armenians. Unfortunately, it collapsed terribly during the nationalist era. But when I was coming to age in college years in the 90s in Turkey, Turkish Jews had established the 500-year anniversary foundation. It was a celebration of the Sephardic arrival to the Ottoman Empire, which happened in 1492, the time of Christopher Columbus, right?
Yeah.
So they were like saying, thank you for saving our ancestors 500 years ago. And it was like a big thing. And on the one hand, I was feeling very sympathetic and feeling warm, and then I was seeing this Palestinian conflict, which was, of course, very disturbing, although it was in a relatively better phase in the 90s. So if you look at history from an Ottoman perspective, Jews are your people. You welcome them. They contributed to the empire. They stood with the empire. There is a long history of Jewish contributions, Jewish support. I have chapters. Ottomans also protected Jews from anti-Semitism. I mean, I have a few sections where I discuss how when the blood libel broke out in Damascus in 1840, it was the Ottoman Sultan Caliph Abdülmecid I who protected the Jews by issuing this edict. And I remind people those stories to saying that, look, Muslims and Jews are not this kind of irreconcilable eternal conflict, as Sayyid Qutb would like to tell us, in his book, Our War with the Jew, or some people, far-right people in Israel, are saying these days. No, this is a modern conflict. We can resolve it. Our religions are compatible. We lived in peace. We can still live in peace. And just, if people both sides can take a step back. And I think looking at it from an Ottoman perspective, that also brings a kind of a more nuanced approach to modernity, and I think even colonialism too, because the Ottomans were never colonized themselves, but they still adopted many ways of the modern West, like constitutionalism and so on and so forth. I think that experience is a little bit different than other parts of the Ummah, the Muslim world, which experienced the modern world mainly through colonialism. And now, the whole story in that lens.
I mean, without getting into too much detail, because I won't really be able to navigate a conversation about Turkish politics, but I mean, is your take that, it's important to tell the story of the diversity within the Ottoman Empire, religious diversity within the Ottoman Empire, and in particular, the safe haven granted to Jews by Ottomans, like that's something to celebrate. Would you say that's something like today in 2024 Turkey is a story people generally like to tell? Is that something people take pride in? Or, are you sort of, swimming upstream, let's say, among Turkish scholars who maybe emphasize more like, we want to just talk about the problem of Zionism and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that's clear enough as a question, but
in Turkey today, you can hear people speaking about how tolerant and pluralist the Ottomans were, not always fully realizing how really diverse it was. It's a kind of a position of power. We tolerated these people, then they betrayed us, sort of thing.
Okay.
Not trying to understand their own story as well. And I see in the book, I show that after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we had a spread of anti-Semitic narratives in the Muslim world, including Turkey itself, which would be news to Ottomans themselves. Like blaming Zionism for the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It's a very classical trope in Islamist circles today. Theodor Herzl, met with Sultan Abdülhamid. He didn't give them
enough land,
Palestine, and then they conspire. I mean, there's a whole narrative. I look into that and I say this is not accurate. And quite the contrary, Jews were on the side of the Ottoman Empire until the very end. Ottoman Jews, and we don't have any evidence of Zionists conspiring.
I mean, it's very typical. I haven't studied this either, so maybe I'll be off and you can correct me. But it's very typical of anti-Semitic narratives that I hear generally. It's always sort of like some kind of sneakiness, conspiratorial. So it seems like kind of an example of a larger trend in anti-Semitism.
Indeed, I mean, there is anti-Semitism clearly in the Muslim world in the 20th century. I show in the book that most of those tropes are imports from Europe.
Okay.
Blood libels. I mean, we didn't have any idea about that until it came from Europe, from French sources mostly. Elders of Zion, it's a Russian hoax. The classical Islam didn't have these ideas. I mean, there was, of course, Islamic superiority. These are the Ummis and all that, but this kind of conspiratorial Jew, that image is a 20th century invention in
Well, but let me push back a little bit and give you a chance to answer this challenge, namely that, I mean, you do in the book actually, so there's a chance to speak about the book more as well. I mean, someone could say, but listen, Mustafa, like, the story of Muhammad and the Jews in Medina, Muhammad enters Medina after the Hijrah, 622, and there's conflict, and eventually all of the Jewish tribes are vanquished in one way or another, the three main Jewish tribes. And a lot of the language in the Sirah, which you may say, well, it's not authentic, it's affected by later sectarian tensions among the Abbasid historical writers. But other language in the Sirah is, this tribe was conspiring with the Quraysh in this way, and that tribe, with the enemies of Muhammad in another way, saying there's different accusations precisely of collaboration with the enemy. So, what would you say back to that?
Well, I have 2 chapters on the book exactly on this issue, and that's a great question. It's an important question. That's why after discussing the Moses of Mecca, in the first chapter, Meccan stories of Moses and that its relevance to first Muslims, I get into the first actual historical encounter between Muslims and Jews in Medina, and there are 2 chapters on that. First of all, that actually begins pretty nicely, right? Mm-hmm. We all know. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is this document called, today we call it the Constitution of Medina. It was a kitab, like a book or like a sahifa or page. But it's a contract. It's like a covenant, political arrangement between these newcomers to Medina, led by Prophet Muhammad, and the people who are in Medina. And they include the Jewish tribes mentioned there as well. And in one of the most remarkable passages, it says, to Muslims their religion, to Jews their religion. Like Muslims and Jews can have their own religions practicing, but Muhammad is now the leader, political arbiter of the city. Now, that's really remarkable. But then we go along the line and we see, oh my God, then there's this Banu Qaynuqa who was treacherous against the Muslims, and Muslims expel them. Then it happens with Banu Nadir, and one of them actually is Ka'b ibn Ashraf, gets even executed because he's allying with the Quraysh, the enemies of Muslims. And then ultimately there's a disturbing story of Bani Qurayza, where the third Jewish tribe in the city, the story is that it's not in the Quran clearly in that sense, but the males are ultimately executed, and women and children become prisoners of war. Now, this is a disturbing story. I admit that. That's why I look into this, and I try to understand why this conflict happened. One thing particularly about Qurayza is that there's a new literature that came out in the past couple of decades, questioning the accuracy of that kind of killing of all males in the Qurayza, tribe. A few Muslim scholars disputed the authenticity of the story. You can say, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, we have only Muslim sources, so it's not recorded in Jewish sources themselves. So we're learning things only from how Muslims told. Mm-hmm. Now, I question the plausibility of such a big number of killing people from looking into the details of that stories. I refer to people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and others who have some interesting new takes on this. Also, in that chapter, I highlight 2 other things. One is this is a political conflict, not a directly religious one, in the sense that Muslims accept that you can practice your religion. They're not forcing Jews to convert to Islam. Mm-hmm. But there is a tension growing all the time, and that tension boils into something political. And that political conflict has a context. That's why I have a whole separate chapter on that, what really happened in Medina, chapter 2. Jews and Muslims found themselves on the 2 sides of the geostrategic, Cold War, actually big hot war at the time. Sassanids and the Byzantines. Mm-hmm. As you would know, I mean, in the early chapters of the Quran, there is some interesting sympathy for the Byzantines. I mean, there's a Surah Rum, the Romans. They will defeat the pagans, and Muslims will rejoice in their victory. And when Muslims are expelled, of course, persecuted in Mecca, the first place they migrate to is Abyssinia, which is an ally of Byzantium. It's a Christian kingdom. So in the early chapters, there is some sympathetic approach to Byzantium, whereas from historical sources, we know that Jews in Arabia were very much worried about Byzantium, and they allied with the Sassanids. The Sassanids would give them a kingdom in Jerusalem, they thought, so they supported the Sassanid conquest of Jerusalem from the Byzantium. So there is this big geostrategic story that people didn't pay much attention to. Some historians lately are doing. I kind of insert that story too, with the message that let's understand that this was mainly a political conflict. Jews could live under Muslim rule, as Yemenese Jews did soon after Islam actually conquered Yemen as well. And I also put Medinan Jews into the context. So the verses in the Quran that criticize Medinan Jews are not universal descriptions of a Jewish character or belief. And that's very clear in certain cases, like Uzair. I mean, the Quran criticizes Jews for saying Uzair is the son of God. They don't have a belief like that. We don't know. But there might be some heretical...
Sometimes thought to be Ezra. I mean, that's
Ezra or Enoch. And there are some sources saying that there were some Jewish beliefs who elevated Enoch into a semi-divine figure indeed. But that would be a very heretical, or let's say unorthodox Judaism. This is just like who were the Christians that Muhammad knew, which ones. So who were the Jews? So, and I try to say, and even in that context, in that confrontational context, the Quran repeatedly says they're not all the same. Some of them are good. So there are kind of those verses. So it's a sad start for the story, but I try to put it in context and bring a political light to it, whereas people tend to see it in more religious terms.
Yeah, and it seems to me that all of this involves also larger theoretical questions about how you think through religious doctrine and practice, right? So, there are many currents within Islam, even within Sunni Islam in particular. There are many currents, and some would emphasize more sort of a literal take of reports about the Prophet or the companion as setting an authoritative example of how Muslims today must act. And we're speaking a little bit before recording. Obviously, there are reformist voices which would say, no, I mean, certain things might have been appropriate for their historical context, but the Prophet doing this or that could be addressing that particular time and place, and whatever dynamics applied then, but not setting an example that necessarily every Muslim must follow for all time. I mean, it's not my role to sort out this debate, obviously, as a non-Muslim.
I'm hearing
it's just an interesting question, right? Like, the real questions is including on this the question of sort of the Jews and Islam. If you're a reformist, you just have kind of more freedom to think creatively through those questions.
Indeed, and I think that, as you point out, the big question here for Muslims is that how much of our religious sources, that's the Quran and Sunnah, that's the Prophet's behavior and transmitted through Hadith. How historical are they? Like the Prophet acted in a certain way. Did he act in a certain way because that was the divine will? Or did he act in a certain way because that's what the Arabs did at the time, right? So how much the urf, the custom, the norms, and the values... Yeah,
the Arabic word urf, meaning custom. Yeah.
How much that had an impact on the building of scripture. Now, in my earlier book, I used the term interactive scripture, the Quran. The Quran responds to real events and real questions and real people. If those people had a different culture, different questions,
it would respond differently.
The Quran would behave differently.
Very interesting.
When you start to think like that, then you say, well, the text becomes less absolute. And then you try to understand what the text and the revelation was trying to do in a particular historical context. And of course, this is relevant to a lot of issues in Islam, women's issues, religious freedom
working out of democracy, civil rights.
Exactly. And I think I can, as a Muslim myself, can make the case that the Quran advanced humanity by all means in 7th century Arabia, on women's rights, on slavery, on what we call human rights today, on religious freedom and all that. But it had constraints too. And its main goal was not to give a political blueprint that will remain there forever. Its main goal was to bring a theological revolution and also moral values that we should keep cultivating and expanding.
Yes.
The way I look into the story of Medina, what happened, why the Prophet established a state now. So that's actually the big question here, right? I mean, why would he? Now, one answer which will be given to you by fellows from Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, they would say establishing the Islamic State was the goal number one from the first day. The Prophet, just marched for that and established the state. My answer is, and Ali Abdel Razik would agree with that, or maybe, I don't know, Said Bey and some people I mentioned in the book. The Prophet just wanted to preach Islam, and he wasn't allowed to do it. He was almost being killed. He escaped the city, and then when he went there, and there was no. If he was living in a Roman Empire, maybe he would do what Jesus did. So his political context forced him to do things.
So consequently, if a Muslim's free to preach Islam, let's say in the U.S. today, that's fine.
Yeah, if you have religious freedom, if you have justice, if you have security in a political system, that political system is good, and we don't need to ask for an Islamic alternative to it. It can be better than what is labeled as Islamic, or worse.
Well, if it's okay, let's get on to a very specific case where Judaism and Islam really seem closer to each other than either with Christianity, namely the relationship with the law. And I think you alluded to that right at the beginning of our conversation today. You have a great chapter called Halal Judaism, Kosher Islam. So, I mean, I struggle this a lot with my students actually here at Notre Dame, when I'm introducing Islam to them, teaching, about some just, getting to know Islam, especially Islamic teaching. One of the hardest things is not actually telling the story of Muhammad and, whatever sort of objections they might make to this or that, but it's just speaking about the role of law in Islam. It's made more complicated by the way Sharia has taken on a certain vibe in American discourse. I'm sure you deal with that all the time. You probably have to explain it a million times a year, what Sharia really is. But it's just, for me, it's important to, help my students at least almost as an exercise in imagination, try to move into a mindset, either in Judaism or in Islam, where, law is like a fundamental aspect of your relationship with God. And by obeying the law, you're expressing your love of God. I mean, this really is very close. I'm going to sort of maybe circle back, follow up with this and say that there are some differences, but it's very close in Judaism and Islam. I mean, the law is good. It's not bad. And you probably deal with Christians, maybe especially Protestant Christians, for whom the law basically is bad. I mean, they will grant that.
It's a bad thing, right? Legalism. So,
Exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so could you just expand on that? Like, how does the law connect Jews and Muslims?
Yeah, that's one of the pillars of the Judeo-Islamic tradition. And indeed, the Sharia and Halakha are very similar, actually, legal traditions. Their content is, first of all, similar. First of all, they're not just law in the modern sense. They're about how to wash your hands and how you eat or how do you pray.
Yeah, much more expensive.
Dress, right? And your kippah or your, I don't know, what do you put on your head, and women and family practices, dietary laws. And that's why actually Muslims and Jews are pretty comfortable in their being in each other's environments. We know there's no pork there. That's why a lot of Muslims in America who cannot find halal food can easily go for kosher food.
Eat kosher.
Because kosher is just a higher standard, more difficult and more complicated. But if it's kosher, it's certainly halal too, unless it has alcohol. I should add that, as another.
You can't have the kosher.
Yeah, kosher wine.
I used to know it. I forgot it. Anyway, let's carry on.
Yeah. And these bring us to the fact that Islam is a religion modeled on Judaism. Actually, in the beginning, I have a quote from Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, from all people. I mean, he's a big, of course, scholar in Islamic study. He says, Islam is, in a sense, Judaism for Gentiles. And Shlomo Dev Gotein, which I quote a lot in the book, he was a big scholar of Islam, Jewish academic. He said, Islam is a recast and enlargement. It's from the flesh and bone of Judaism, but as a recast and enlargement. It just brought this Semitic Abrahamic monotheism out of the Jews to all the Gentile peoples around the world, including my people, the Turks, to Indonesians and all that. Now, Christianity did this too, but Christianity had new aspects to it, right? The theology is somewhat different, and the detachment from the law is also different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this means to me, oh my God, the first I noticed is, I mean, a long time ago. How did then Jews do this modern democracy thing? If they have their halakha and we have the Sharia, that they don't have halakhic states. How did this work? Oh, actually, there's minorities for a long time. Yes. But what about the theory of it? Should halakha not run the state, or just should be a voluntarily followed law? So those questions brought me to study the evolution of halakha in Judaism and compare it with the Sharia. And there are a few chapters about that. There's a chapter on Islamic rationalism and impact on Judaism, which also discusses Sharia and halakha. I first of all look at not one thing. Maimonides, the great Moses Maimonides, when he writes in Judeo-Arabic, right? I mean, Hebrew letters about the Arabic language. He says our Sharia. He's speaking of Jewish law as our Sharia. So he uses the word Sharia for Jewish law itself. So to all those people who want to ban Sharia in Texas or Oklahoma, I guess things will get complicated if you go down that road. Now, of course, parts of the halakha are obsolete. People are not being stoned for adultery today, right? Or Sabbath breakers are not, executed, or things like that. So the penal code, especially of the halakha, became obsolete over time, mostly because Jews were minorities and they got used to understanding the halakha not as state law, but as a communal code, right? And with the Enlightenment, with Moses Mendelssohn and the whole Haskalah Jewish Enlightenment period, they even began to emphasize the individuality of that. You obey the halakha because you want to worship God as a Jew, but it's your freedom of conscience to do that. It's not going to be imposed on you by an outside authority. Now, when Moses Mendelssohn made this argument, he got questions from the Christians of the time. But how can you say that? Your religion is founded on theocracy. Moses did that. So on top of that, he wrote this book, Jerusalem on Religious Power. And I go through that book in a chapter, and I show how it is similar to our discussions in Islam today, right? So I see, and there's also parts where I introduced the importance of reason in understanding the Sharia and halakha. You're familiar, I'm sure you're familiar, we have this tradition of maqasid al-Sharia, the intentions of the Sharia. Exactly like that in Judaism, there's a tradition called Ta'ami HaMitzvot. Correct my Hebrew, which doesn't exist. But
I can't do it. I can't do it.
It means intent. It means reasons for commandment. So Maimonides himself says some Jews believe that you just have to follow the commandments. You cannot ask why. But he says, no, we have to ask and understand why. That's why Maimonides represents a rationalist strain in Judaism. And I show in Islam, we have both the rationalists like that and also the counter-rationalists too. Yes. But that rationalist tradition ultimately takes Judaism to a very interesting point in the modern era, which is Reform Judaism. And I even think, well, will be something like this maybe in the Islamic civilization in the centuries ahead. Because if you understand the law has a purpose, and the purpose is more important than the letter of the law, that takes you to an interesting switch, which, again, has happened in Judaism formally with Reform Judaism, partly through conservative Judaism. And Islam, a lot of Muslims are actually now entertaining that thought when they speak about maqasid, the intentions, rather than the letter of the law.
So there's a really key aspect to this, which is the interplay between the law as theory and the interest in knowing God's will. I mean, Sharia is ultimately God's will. Of course you want to know it, right? Of course you want to, what Muslims call fiqh. You want to think about this, how can we actually know, either in a theoretical way or in a very practical way, what God wills. So is this action, required, forbidden, or something in between? So you have that kind of theoretical dimension. But where the rubber really seems to hit the road is, the living this out or legislating it. And we don't have to get into a larger discussion about politics and religion or political Islam or anything. But I do have a general sense that there's a difference here in the relationship with the law between Jews and Muslims. Obviously, it's tough to compare because there's so much diversity within each group. So like Judaism, of course, you have Orthodox, various versions of Orthodox, the modern Orthodox, different kinds of more conservative so-called ultra-Orthodox, all the way to Reform Judaism, as you said. But I mean, even among at least the modern Orthodox, for example, Svi Novik has appeared on this channel. My colleague here at Notre Dame is, great as Jewish studies scholar. He speaks very eloquent on these things. A lot of the conversation around the law strikes me with Jews to be more theoretical. So, I mean, love of law is sort of for its own sake. Like, it's God's law, so we love it. We seek to understand it. Obviously, very religious Jews spend, years and years studying the Talmud and all that sort of stuff. Whereas I have the sense that for more religious Muslims, you actually want to know, like, can I do this or that? Like, I follow a guy on Twitter, a Saudi sheikh who tweets in English, and he's being asked questions all the time, like, can I buy this shoe? Like, is this okay to wear this shoe? Or, does such and such an act ruin my state of ritual purity? Certain way of going to the bathroom, or like, and people actually want to know. Do you know what I mean, Mustafa? Like, they actually want the sheikh to say, this is fine, it's jaiz or whatever, it's permitted, or it's not. Do you know what I mean? That at least in a lot of currents of lived Islam today, it seems that the law is more of like an applied sort of thing than with Judaism.
I mean, yeah, fatwa websites are full of endless questions about minor details in life. And I mentioned that in Reopening Muslim Minds, my earlier book. And I think, that goes too extreme in some cases because you lost the ethical value.
The spirituality or the ethical or spiritual,
sometimes people justify something unethical by simply thinking through the mechanistics of, legal interpretation. Now, I think the same thing can be observed in...
Like whether, maybe this is a dumb example, but yesterday I was with my colleague here at Notre Dame, Munim Siri, and he was teaching on Indonesia, and he said he found the vast majority of young Indonesians, they feel like it's forbidden to say Merry Christmas to Christians. You cannot wish them Merry Christmas. Because there are different, there's these principles of wala wal bara, and there's hadith about this and stuff. But it just seems like, guys, what's the big deal? Like, seriously, like, what's going to happen if you say Merry Christmas? Anyway.
What's the big deal? That's a very American question, and good question too. But I mean, I know I discuss with fellow Muslims who have these views, and I try to, bring in different views to that sort of thinking. But I should say, I mean, similar, I think, extreme legalism exists in some Jewish communities too, if I'm not wrong. I mean, I can be corrected by who knows the world, especially in the ultra-Orthodox community, I think. Now, one big difference in Judaism is that since there is no halakhic state, and there is no state which takes one of those views in Judaism and imposes on everybody else.
Makes it a sort of civil code.
I mean, you have this, you have that, and one thing I say in the book is that Jews don't do takfir on each other. That's something we should learn from Muslims. Like, I mean, the Jews, because they used to living without a state defined by Judaism. So some Jews go that way, even if they might have disagreements, or sometimes even maybe, I think some Orthodox may not be looking at the reform in a very positive light. But there's no mechanism to have an inquisition and to go after these people and persecute them through the mechanisms of a state. And I think that diversity within Judaism is, to me, interesting. That is what we Muslims should ideally have too, right? We have some of our ultra-Orthodox. They'll be there. I'm happy if they are happy with that. I mean, we have modern Orthodoxy, which is maybe the mainstream Sunni Shia positions. We may have reform and also some Jews are not even that practicing, just cultural. Actually, we have Muslims like that too, millions and millions. But I think we need a more formal, tolerant acceptance of that. And oh my God, this is bid'ah, this is kufr, this is all the kind of name callings among Muslims. Actually, in a part of the book, I say, hey, look, Jews didn't have a state for 1,000 years and 2,000 years, and that brought a lot of terrible things on them, right? The persecution. But they learned how to be just a civil society force, and they don't have these inquisitional minds against each other now.
And the amazing thing is, they were part of that journey of Europe, for example.
Out
of the Christian.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I mean, they learn how to be a minority and contribute to that society,
Yes,
have a
yes,
say in that society, which is, I think, an
yes,
interesting experience for Muslims.
yes. And they were part of the the ups and downs of Europe, going from Christendom, through Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, Romantic period, Marxism. I mean, they played a role in all of that, in every aspect of that. And then one of the really incredible stories you tell in the book, The Islamic Moses, how the Prophet inspired Jews and Muslims to flourish together and change the world, um, is the story of how mostly German-speaking Jews, we're talking about the 19th century, so Germany is just kind of becoming a thing, but mostly German-speaking Jews, they, developed a particular admiration and appreciation of Islam, Islamic societies. One of the most visual representations who kind of paint this picture for us of mosque building in Europe, but apparently also in some places in the U.S. I forget where, that there was this style of, sorry, I said mosque building.
Cincinnati area, Moorish synagogues, right?
Yeah, okay. So I meant to say exactly synagogue building in a so-called Moorish style. So kind of imagining what kind of an Islamic synagogue, if we put it that way, or a synagogue in the Islamic world would look like. And that's sort of a manifestation or visualization of a larger intellectual trend, namely that somehow Jews belong as part of kind of the East in a way. This plays out in a particular way in the story of early Islamic studies scholars, German-speaking Jews. But I mean, could you comment about like kind of this trend occurring in the 19th century?
Sure. You're referring to the chapter titled "The Good Orientalist."
Exactly.
It's another
Yeah.
place where I kind of question some of the dominant narratives. Now, Orientalism is a bad word among Muslims. You're probably familiar.
I've been called Mustashriq and Orientalist
How do you
ad nauseum.
Yourself not a Muslim, right? I mean, that's well. I mean, to be fair, I mean, it goes back to some understandable, of course, roots. That I mean, Edward Said wrote his book Orientalism. He was critical of some of the biases you find in Western scholarship. I think Said did criticize important problems. But
Edward Said, the Palestinian-American scholar at Columbia University.
Yeah, it's a great contribution. He showed how power can manipulate knowledge. So I think there's a lot of important value there. But also then people start to see Western study of Islam only as this kind of colonial, biased, arrogant, conspiratorial kind of scheme. So seeing problems is one thing. Seeing only problems is another thing. And so I think Orientalism, the Western study of Islam, is more complicated. Well, Gabriel, you study Islam. I found your works very fair and factual, and like you and many other scholars like that. Not everybody is kind of studying Islam to conspire against it. And I particularly highlighted the story of German Jewish Orientalists, which is interesting because Said typically spoke about French and British Orientalisms, and they were colonial powers at the time.
Right.
The colonial enterprise was definitely linked with that. But in Germany was not a colonial power until the end.
It wasn't even a thing. It wasn't even a thing till, I guess, Bismarck, 1860s or something. I'm probably getting the dates wrong. But
it was not. And also, German scholars of Islam were mostly Jewish, very interesting. They had a whole different rationale and motivation. They found Islam sympathetic as an Eastern Semitic religion with a great civilization, while they were still being seen in Europe with some anti-Semitic lens by some other people. So they identified 100%. With Islam. They were the ones who highlighted medieval Spain as this, beacon of tolerance, even sometimes romantically, some people would say today. They wrote some of the most respectful, depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. Ignaz Goldziher, as you know, studied Hadith and highlighted some problems there. Now, some people today think that, that was a conspiracy against another Jewish conspiracy. But actually, no, he was very friendly and sympathetic, respectful.
No, that's a real service that you offer in the book when you speak about, Hungarian, at the time it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and everything's under the Habsburgs. But, you tell the story of Goldziher, who wrote principally in German. I actually don't know if he wrote anything in Hungarian. But, you make it clear that, listen, like you have, I believe, as any historian has responsibility to present the world in which a historical figure is living and acting, and you do that with Goldziher. You show that Goldziher went to the Islamic world. He went to Cairo. I mean, I think it's with Goldziher.
During Friday prayers,
praying, joining the Islamic prayer, and speaking of actually doing a sajda and pressing his forehead against the ground at the mosque.
And that is also possible because Islam and Judaism are theologically very compatible religions in the sense that there's not much tension there. You wouldn't be able to join a church service, maybe I would say, in the same comfort because of the difference between Christian theology.
No, he would feel who knows? I didn't know the guy, but he would probably feel, especially a Catholic or Orthodox church, with imagery and statues, and then the ritual of the Eucharist itself, which would seem totally unusual.
Yeah. So in that chapter, I mean that story has been highlighted by some Jewish academics contemporary, like Bernard Lewis was among them, Susanna Heschel here in the U.S., Martin Kramer, who's from Israel. I kind of looked into their works, and I myself looked into those original sources. So there is this very interesting array of Jewish, German, Orientals, European, not just German, but Germany was the hub of it, Orientals in the 19th century, which looked at Islam in a very sympathetic way. One of them became Muslim and became one of the greatest scholars, Muhammad Asad. I mean,
Leopold Weiss.
Yeah, Leopold Weiss. He
became Asad. I'm sure you know this because his given name was Leopold, which means lion.
Yeah,
Asad in Arabic means lion.
Exactly. And he's one of the great Quran commentators, translators.
And controversial.
He's modernist, right? Here you go. So
100%. Yeah.
But I think they brought a good perspective too. I think Goldziher's take on hadiths maybe too much for some people today, but I think he brought the recognition that these hadiths are reflecting some sectarian divisions in Islam. They are probably written after the Prophet Muhammad. It's hard to...
and addressing. That's a whole other topic. Maybe we shouldn't go there, but let me not go there. So that's. I mean, as he saw it, he had. I mean, I think you agree with this. He didn't have a project to undermine the Sunnah and sort of ruin the religion of Muslims. No, he just analyzed a hadith in the best he could, and this is what he saw. And
they were Reformed Jews themselves, which also explains how they looked at Islam. They had a sense of a religious tradition, which is at the core, you respect and love it and value it, but then you're open to seeing the problems within there, and you're ready to make that separation. So Goldziher, Geiger, these were all. And now some Muslims will say, they didn't believe the Prophet Muhammad really received revelation. Like I would say, okay, I'm not expecting that much. I mean,
then they would be Muslim.
Then they'll be a Muslim. So we're not expecting people to be Muslim to study Islam fairly and accurately. If he's Muslim, welcome. That's okay. But I mean, and as I said, one of them did. But I think there's another interesting chapter there. Another chapter in the Judeo-Islamic tradition, as I call it, is the Good Orientalist chapter, which again is forgotten today.
Yes.
People think that, Jewish and Christian approaches from the West have been always negative.
Yeah. I had really one connection with one of those great, great figures. Sorry, it's a little bit selfish of me to kind of get in this wistful, nostalgic story, but I got to know a man named Franz Rosenthal.
Oh my God.
Who's a scholar at Yale. And he actually passed away, God rest his soul, when I was still a graduate student at Yale. And he was already retired. He used to go on regular walks with my own advisor, who was a German Catholic priest by the name of Gerhard Bövring. Franz Rosenthal was a German Jew who fled from the Nazis and one of the great scholars of Islam.
Yeah.
He wrote wonderful books on the literary and intellectual heritage of Islam.
I mean, glad to hear that. I'm a fan of Rosenthal. I mean, I read his book, Muslim Concept of Freedom, before the, I think, 19th century or modern era, many years ago. He translated also the Muqaddimah.
Exactly. That's the one. Yep.
Which I have on my computer. And, it's a great service that the greatest social scientists from the medieval, Islamic civilization, Khaldun, became vastly known in the West thanks to Franz Rosenthal. Yes. It's a really great translation.
Yes. Well, before we wrap up here, I just want to circle back to Turkey and the Turkish context. You use the phrase in the book, Ottoman Jewish exceptionalism. We already touched on this, and you told the story of the blood libel incident in Damascus, I think it was 1840, and other ways in which there really was sort of, I don't know, there's a good story to tell about the Jews in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, you make the case that it was actually more complicated for Christians in the Ottoman Empire because there were major Christian powers with whom the Ottoman Empire was in conflict more or less constantly. I mean, Russia prominently, but also the great powers of Western Europe. But whereas Jews, there's no possibility of being, a sort of a secret collaborator behind so-called enemy lines. So yeah, I just wanted to, give you a chance to speak a little bit about that as well, but then maybe also tie it into, as much as you feel comfortable or is appropriate, what you hear in Turkey today. Is this especially with all the political changes in Turkey? I mean, is all hope lost basically of sort of this message that even the Turkish Republic, obviously it's not the Ottoman Empire, it's different, but even the Turkish Republic can be a place of openness, hospitality, a kind of capaciousness, that there are resources in the Ottoman history that can be recalled to serve Turkish society today?
Whew, very big question.
You can skip it if you want. Yeah.
Well, let's begin with the Ottoman Jewish exceptionalism. There,
Okay.
what I emphasize there is that Ottoman Empire was a mosaic of many peoples. You see the gradual collapse of the empire with revolts against the empire, right? And the Ottomans tried to suppress them,
Yeah.
with a heavy hand and bloody expulsions and persecution and all that. It began in the Balkans with the Greeks and the Serbs and Bulgarians, and Ottomans thought that the Muslims will hold, but even then you see Albanians having a revolt, and there was even a limited Arab revolt in the Hijaz during World War I. And that made Ottoman Turks themselves growingly more Turkish nationalist, which gave you the nationalist, zeal of the Union and Progress, the Young Turks, which led to Kemalism and the Turkish Republic. Now, very interesting story there is that Jews never became a target of Turkish nationalism or the Ottoman self-defense, let's say, because Jews never had a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. And Jews always even sided with the Ottomans. I mean, you see the stories in the New York Times in 1913 that Greek nationalists are attacking Turks and Jews together. And they think Jews are the Turks, spies or enemies. Actually, that's a theme I cover in the book. There are stories of, in the medieval times too, the Jew as the fifth column of the Muslim. There are times in history that, for strategic reasons, Jews found themselves better under Islam. For example, conquest of Spain from the Visigoths, Jews welcomed the Muslim conquerors because Visigothic Spain was very oppressive on them. And then the Jewish, so today I'm telling, look, this whole Jewish conspiracy thing is just look into it. They were our conspiratorial allies at it's more complex than what you think. And this is just bias against the minority. And I said, minorities everywhere look up to who can be better to them. Right? They would then to survive. So I tell that story, and I show that until the end of the Ottoman Empire, it was the best place for Jews in the world. Of course, in Europe, in England, they had got equal rights. In America, that was much better. But compared to Russia, especially in that part of the world, that's why there is a 19th century Jewish lobby in the United Kingdom, all pro-Ottoman and against Russia, because Russia was the real enemy of the Ottomans. So I kind of remind those political contexts that people can understand that today's conflict is also political and not religious.
Yes.
Regarding Turkey today, in the Republic, Turkish Republic, born 100 years ago, we went from one extreme to another, ultimately. The early republic, led by Atatürk, staunch secularist, was born with this kind of excessive denial of the Ottoman past and the Islamic past. And Turks, you bend the fez and you make everybody wear the European hats so they become European, and that kind of like almost tragicomical revolutions impose from bottom. So it was a modernizing effort. I appreciate parts of it, like giving equal rights to women, but it went too far in pushing a French style secularism and a cultural self-denial of the past. Then Turkey started to find actually some middle ground in the 20th century with visionary leaders like Turgut Özal, whom I respect a lot, that were kind of softening the secularism, harsh secularism a bit, but still continuing a more kind of EU process and some modernization. Then now we went to the other end in Turkey, that the whole modern era is vilified and the Ottoman past is glorified. Now, I'm all for glorifying Ottoman past, but for the good reasons. Not because we had unquestionable mighty sultans, and not just the power element of it, but also the pluralism.
It's not about the glory of Islam and the
exactly.
Turks.
Not just reopening Hagia Sophia with a sword in your hand and showing that, you are the new conquerors again. All that happened, but there are better things in the Ottoman history that I would emphasize. I would emphasize that, for example, the Greek Halki Seminary in Istanbul, which is closed for more than 50 years. It's like, it's a violation of religious freedom of Turkey's Greek citizens, Greek Orthodox citizens. It was opened by the Ottomans. I mean, the Ottomans didn't have a problem with Christian institutions. The Republic came with a nationalist zeal. And today there's a more of a religious nationalism, which claimed to correct some of those mistakes in the beginning, but it doesn't show interest. So Turkey is not in a very good place now, if you ask me. But history is open. I would hope that we had one extreme and another extreme reaction to that. I would hope for a Turkey where the two really bitterly divided camps in society, religious versus secular, can have a live and let live sort of constitutional order and a political culture. I will still hope for that. I will pray to see that and, maybe write for that. But still, I think there is a story to remember from some of the things that happened in the Ottoman, especially in the Reform Tanzimat period, accepting of equal citizenship for Jews and Christians, for example, which is still an issue. Like the dhimmi, you have walls, you're untouchable. Some people think like that. The Ottomans changed that, brought equal citizenship. Things like apostasy laws became obsolete in the late Ottoman Empire. The state decided not to implement those. Women's education. And I just wrote a piece for the magazine Law and Liberty, the Ottoman Caliphate, Jews and the Tragedy of the Middle East. It begins with a quote from the book. The last Ottoman caliph, 1924, when he was exiled from Turkey, the last person to say farewell to him, a very warm farewell, was an Ottoman Jew. And I tell that story and I say, why? Well, let's discover it together. So that enters into the Ottoman chapter.
Terrific.
I mean, there are terrible things in Ottoman history too. I mean, Christian children were enlisted for the Ottoman army, taken from their parents. A lot of bloody suppression of revolts. And I'm not glorifying any of that. What we choose from history to amplify today is, I think, important. And I'm an Ottomanist in terms of having a sense of pluralism, religious pluralism in that region, and ethnic pluralism too. Turkey is not exactly fully on that page now, but I hope it might come to a better future.
Yes. Well, something I generally admire about all your books, and I'm going to mention a few others here. By the way, thank you, friends, if you watched this long, for being with us. All the links to the books of Mustafa will be in the description down below. And something you find in all of his books is a fidelity to, as much as possible, good historical research, and not sort of reshaping history with some ulterior motive in mind. I mean, it takes, you see this in the book, The Islamic Moses, as well. You always have this nuanced way of saying, listen, there's some things we have to admit, we Muslims, we Turks, whatever, may not like it, but we have to admit this. There's also positive stuff. So you have this very sober-minded way of speaking history. And then you have this visionary way of speaking about moral, ethical, and political issues in the here and now. So that comes through in the newly released book, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. I assume you can get that at that big online bookstore or directly from the publisher, St. Martin's, I think.
St. Martin's Press. Also, it's available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. Yeah.
And then, just if you're on Amazon or some other less of a monopoly book selling website, just click on Mustafa's name, get to his other books as well. So 2021, there's a really excellent book on the case for thinking with rationalism within the Islamic context, prioritizing reason and rationalism as a Muslim thinker. That book is called Reopening Muslim Minds, Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. That's 2021. There's a shorter book, but making the case very powerfully for religious liberty, which is entitled Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. That's in 2021. And I guess a companion piece to the Islamic Moses is the 2017 book, The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Anything else?
You had very thoughtfully reviewed. Thank you for that again in the first things. Yeah.
Pleasure. Yeah. Yeah. So, Mustafa, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, on a personal level and intellectual level, to chat with you on exploring the Quran.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Exactly the same. My thoughts. It's a pleasure, to see you again. Thank you for all the, advertisement for the books. And inshallah, let's get together in person soon at some point.
Inshallah.